Congressman Bridenstine, you all know him. He has been an advocate of space since his beginning of time within Congress just a few short years ago. He introduced the Space Renaissance Act, which, as he said at the time, was not intended to be passed as a total bill, but a series of initiatives, many of which, as you shared with us last night, have already been passed. He also has a long history of military service in the wrong part of the military for the beginning of his service, but he shifted over to the Air Force recently, and he's been both a naval aviator and an Air Force aviator, and I think that's fantastic to have members of Congress like Congressman Bridenstine who have that close connection to the national security community. And that synergy between his interest in space and interest in military shows up in his committee assignments, both on the committee that Congressman Babin runs on, the subcommittee on space, on the Science and Technology Committee, but also on the House Armed Services Strategic Forces subcommittee. He's been a great advocate and, quite frankly, a great collaborator on other things in my previous job. Sir, I appreciate all of the support you've given me over the years, and let me turn the mic over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doug, and thank you to the Air Force Association, to the Mitchell Institute, Jakes and Associates, who puts this together for the second year. I hope that this is an event that continues year in and year out because it is critically important. And I do appreciate Doug going easy on me. Last night, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award, and I might have talked about his age and how you achieve a Lifetime Achievement Award. And but I assured him at the end that he wasn't old. He's got a couple of weeks left, which is good. Excuse me. So anyway, it's good to be here. Thank you for having me. I want to be really clear about how broad and bipartisan the support is for national security space, but generally in space. Whether it's commercial, civil, or national security, there's very broad bipartisan support. There's broad bipartisan support for the president's budget increase for defense spending. I will also tell you that you'll find broad bipartisan support for even more defense spending, and especially the national security space budget. An increase of $350 million compared to President Obama's proposed budget for fiscal year 18 is certainly helpful in making necessary advances. There is concern, though, that the $722 million in unfunded priorities from the Air Force, of which more than $300 million is related to mission-critical topics like space defense and BMC-2, does not stave the impending threat and the readiness bow wave. My work in this year's National Defense Authorization Act has been focused on bolstering our warfighting posture of our space forces and continuing efforts to advance capability when it comes to acquisition and fielding. I want to talk about three specific things as it relates to warfighting. Number one, I think it's time that we institutionalize, if you will, a space flag. Much like red flag in the Air Force. In the Navy, we would call it Air Wing Fallon. Some people would say it's Top Gun. Top Gun is one component of the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center, which does Air Wing Fallon, which is a large force exercise. But I think it's important that we start exercising our space warfighters. And I also am made aware, after we had this as a proposal in the National Defense Authorization Act, I was made aware that Air Force has already done a space flag at a grassroots level, not required by Congress or anything like that, but just because it's necessary and appropriate, and they've already done one. And we want to make sure that we build from there and make sure that it's adequately funded. We also want to make sure that when we do a space flag, that we're appropriately providing the red forces that are required to adequately test the tactical environment. The purpose of a space flag is not a long-term strategic thing. It is about, in a tactical environment, when there are warfighters on the ground, how do we make sure that we can provide them what they need in a contested space environment? For those of us who fly in the Air Force, or maybe in the Navy, it is those first 10 missions that you need to get behind you, and then all of a sudden the probability of your success in future missions goes way up. That's why this kind of exercise is important. And we want to make sure that we have a policy proposal in the NDAA to make a space flag part of our effort to get those first 10 missions behind all of our warfighters in the space domain. We also have a policy proposal in the NDAA for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to do a war plan evaluation that accounts for a contested space environment. John Hamre, who is a former Deputy Secretary of Defense, has testified before the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, on which I serve with Chairman Rogers, and he has talked about stress testing our capabilities in a contested environment, something that maybe we haven't done as robustly as we ought to have, and maybe something where there are maybe incorrect assumptions about what that stress test might result in. Some people have talked about what would the United States Air Force look like if we had a day without GPS, and how would we fight through such a day. So this has been a policy proposal by a lot of folks who have been in the Department of Defense, but it's something that I think it's finally time that we put into law and make happen. There's another area that I think is critically important, and that is space situational awareness and enterprise battle management, command and control. The National Space Defense Center, or what used to be called the JICSPOC, it's time to really start adequately funding it, getting it off the ground, and making sure that the GEON, the Joint Emerging Operational Needs, get funded. We talk about joint emerging operational needs, and then they end up on the unfunded priority list. To me, if it's a GEON, it ought to be funded. And there are a whole host of things that if you look at the budget request are not funded. So I will tell you that I think it's important for Congress to step up here and start making advancements on these things. Some of them would include a systems integration lab, which was unfunded at the tune of about $48 million for the, not necessarily the GEON specifically, but for the National Space Defense Center. There's a commercial consortia that would cost about $15 million that, in my opinion, must be funded, because ultimately it's going to be commercial providers that are going to be able to create the solutions necessary to fight through a contested environment in space. And there are ideas that we haven't even thought of yet, that when we put different commercial providers inside of an integration lab or inside of a lab to determine the best courses of action, whether it's modeling and simulation or otherwise, we're going to be able to discover things and learn things that ultimately are going to be necessary to funding an enterprise battle management command and control system for the space domain. Some of the things that are important in the GEON, the Joint Emerging Operational Needs, would be threat indications and warning. We need better space situational awareness, but we also need to be able to identify and attribute what that threat is, try to determine intent, and ultimately be prepared to deal with threats that are in the space environment. We need a spectrum COP. I mean, the reality is there's all kinds of spectrum challenges that we have. Many of it is just blue-on-blue interference. These are things that we need to be aware of, that sometimes jamming isn't necessarily intentional. Sometimes it's us doing it to ourselves. So I think it's important that we be able to attribute what the jamming is from, and then ultimately deal with it in the appropriate manner. And in many cases, it will be hostile, but that's not always the case. I think modeling and simulation is important. It's also part of the GEON requirements. Modeling and simulation is going to be critical for us to ultimately determine how to deal with the threats that are out there, and also be able to get in front of what those threats may be. And again, it could be jamming, it could be dazzling, it could be all the different types of threats. It could be kinetic threats in space, direct descent anti-satellite missiles, co-orbital anti-satellite capabilities. So all of these things, the total BMC2 unfunded priorities amount to about $152 million. And I believe that we ought to be making those investments now. And this is how we fight and win wars. This is not some of the other things that you've heard me talk about at the past, especially at this. We talk about the SATCOM Pathfinder. I'm a big advocate of the SATCOM Pathfinder. The idea that you can purchase a transponder on a commercial satellite and then trade that transponder for global portable bandwidth for the warfighter throughout the entire world. Critically important concept that needs to be moved out on. We've run into challenges in the law about the color of money. Is it acquisitions money or is it operations and maintenance money? And ultimately, can we legally go forward with this? And of course, many of you in the room have helped me put together these concepts that need to be put into law. But I would also say Pathfinder is critically important, but what we're talking about here is how to more adequately, efficiently buy the bandwidth necessary for the warfighter. It's an acquisition challenge. When we talk about a GEON, a Joint Emerging Operational Need, that relates directly to what is happening today in space to fight and win a war, that to me ought to be funded at an even higher priority. We're going to have, of course, policy proposals for hosted payloads, as we always do. We want to make sure that we're distributing architectures, driving down costs, taking advantage of every launch and every bus that's being put into space. So we're going to have provisions for the hosted payloads as well. We're going to once again do our commercial weather data pilot program. It's been a big priority of mine on the civil side as it relates to NOAA. The idea that you can buy commercial GPS radio occultation data, feed that data into a data assimilation system, and then ultimately it goes into a numerical weather prediction model, and we can improve weather forecasting. Well, we're moving out very rapidly on that, primarily because of Congress, but we're moving out on it on the civil side. And what that does is it distributes the architecture, it drives down costs. The government is one of many customers, and ultimately you get more competition in the marketplace, so you get, in fact, more data, and in some cases better data to feed the weather models and drive down costs and improve weather modeling, weather forecasting. So we're going to do that again. We did it last year in the NDAA. It got funded in the defense appropriations. We're going to do that again this year. We're going to plus it up a little bit and make sure that we get more data and better data, take advantage of all the great commercial capabilities that currently exist. So these are just some of the priorities that I have, and we're going to be continuing to work on. And certainly many of you in this room have been working with us on these issues, and we greatly appreciate that. Our door is always open. We want to hear from you. We want to understand what your concerns are, and that includes both people in uniform and the industry that ultimately supports the people in uniform. So if it's okay, I'll just open it up to a few questions, and then I got to catch an airplane.
Thank you, Congressman. John Harper with National Defense Magazine. You listed a number of unfunded requirements. Do you anticipate, or do you sense that there's bipartisan support in Congress for actually funding those? You noted there was support in general for a lot of the things in the FY18 budget, but among the things that weren't included, that you consider priorities, do you think that Congress will add that funding?
I do. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, so we are the authorizers. And when you think about the National Defense Authorization Act, I would tell you there's broad bipartisan support for marking to $640 billion for the Department of Defense, which is above the president's budget request. And that's bipartisan. I want to be clear that there's broad bipartisan support for the president's budget request that already pluses up defense. The challenge is we have been so damaged over the last 8 years under the sequester that this is a big hole to climb out of when it comes to capability. And a lot of people are aware, I used to fly in the United States Navy as I did counter-drug operations in the E-2 Hawkeye. And my squadron, we busted about $2 billion worth of cocaine every year on the high seas. My squadron was eliminated under the sequester. And that's $2 billion worth of cocaine that now comes into the country. It's $2 billion worth of cash that now funds transnational criminal organizations that are destabilizing Central and South America. And it gives the competitors of the United States the countries around the world that are not so friendly. It gives them opportunities to partner with countries in our own hemisphere that are not going to be good partnerships for the United States of America. Bottom line is this: the capabilities that we have lost under the defense budgets for the previous years are pretty significant. I just gave you one example, and it's a personal example for me. But that's happened across the entire Department of Defense. So there's broad bipartisan support to say that the president's budget request is a good step. But I would also say there's broad bipartisan support to go the next step.
And specifically with regard to the unfunded requirements for space, you
yes.
said that there's...
Absolutely. I will tell you, there's one area, there's more bipartisan support than any other area, and that's when it comes to space security. And everybody now, I think, understands in Congress, and I don't think this was true when I first got to Congress, but because of the work of a lot of people in this room and others, people now understand the strategic significance of space. The idea that if we lose GPS, we also lose banking, which is a strategic vulnerability for the United States of America. People on both sides of the aisle, and I know we're living in this very contentious political environment, but I would also tell you, I wish the American people could see, Brian Babin working with Ed Perlmutter to get to the bill that he was just talking about, the American Space Commerce Free Enterprise Act. I mean, we're talking about bipartisan support to do things that are good for America's space enterprise, and it's really across the board. So, and of course, when it comes to national security space, it's just the same. So.
Good questions. We got some back there, all the way in the back, pink shirt.
Yeah, hi, Congressman James Drew from Aviation Week. I'm wondering if I could get your opinion on the Air Force's process for getting off the RD-180 engine. Blue Origin has had some setbacks with its engine testing. AR-1's going to be funded a little bit more because of that delay. ULA still hasn't down-selected an engine for its Vulcan. So there's lots of movements happening, and do you think the Air Force is doing enough and has enough control over the process? And then also, with all the activity on the smaller launch commercial space side, with everything that's going on over in California and the deserts over there, is the Air Force embracing those guys enough?
I would say yes, but I would also say that it needs congressional support. The RD-180 engine, that's been put into law now. I don't know anybody in this NDAA that's going to be making proposals to adjust what was put into law last year as far as the process to get us away from the RD-180 engine. I do think it's important that we not be dependent for national security launch, to be dependent on countries that are not always friendly to the United States and in many cases hostile to the United States. On the small launch vehicles, the venture class launch vehicles, yes, the Air Force is making efforts, and in fact, we're actually going to make it one of our priorities to do responsive launch demonstrations to plus up funding to about $30 million. Now, that's to get the studies done and to move forward in a direction where we can take advantage of these venture class launch capabilities. But companies like Virgin Galactic and Rocket Lab and others are doing really amazing work that ultimately we need to be taking advantage of. And I think there's going to be broad bipartisan support of that for responsive launch. With all the threats that are in space, we need satellites to get smaller, we need architectures to be more distributed, and we need to have the capability to rapidly reconstitute when those architectures are threatened. And what you're talking about with these venture class capabilities, they're going to be able to do that. Also, when you think about commercial communications going from geostationary orbit down to low Earth orbit, Boeing has a constellation, OneWeb has a constellation, SpaceX has a constellation. All these different constellations are going to be launching potentially satellites, maybe the size of a microwave, maybe the size of a dishwasher, into low Earth orbit in the thousands. And that's, in essence, going to drive the markets that give us, the United States government, an opportunity to take advantage of those markets as well. So I believe that's going to develop under all circumstances. I believe the United States government needs to be prepared to take advantage of those developments. But it's not something necessarily we need to drive, although I'm not against driving it if it helps us get there quicker or at least provides more certainty in the process. but I believe that capability for smaller launches to low Earth orbit, to specific orbits, it's only going to grow, and I think the United States government will be able to take advantage of it. Look, commercial, in many cases these days, moves far faster than the government, and we need to be prepared to take advantage of it.
Morning, Joe Dodd from LinkQuest. We heard this morning from the Secretary of the Air Force, someone who has great national security space experience, and it's clearly a priority. She announced that she signed just this morning the new A11. She didn't call it A11, but the Deputy Chief of Staff for Space. So the momentum is, and the trajectory of that, I think people in this room who care about national security space is all in the right direction. That said, there's been suggestion we need a defense space agency, or that the department and the Air Force, the steward of national security space, perhaps is not doing enough or not moving quickly enough. What are your thoughts on all those things stirred together?
Well, that's a great question. I know it's a hot topic right now. Chairman Mike Rogers, chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, great friend of mine. And of course, if anybody, I'm sure a lot of people were at the Space Symposium this year, or at least you read the reporting from the Space Symposium. He has a very aggressive agenda to make sure that the United States of America has at its core the ability to defend and fight in space. And it's not because we want to, it's because it's where we are in the world today. Unfortunately, we have to be prepared. I will tell you that there's probably going to be some resistance in the Pentagon. There's probably going to be some resistance in the Air Force. I think the A11 is an effort to move in the right direction. But I do think that there are people in Congress that have a belief that adding one more person to the acquisition process is not the right answer. I'm going to tell you my position. I'm agnostic at this point. I'm learning more. But I will tell you, I would encourage you to read the remarks of Chairman Rogers from the Space Symposium, because I think that's going to give you a good idea where the committee might go. But I will also tell you, Chairman Rogers wants to listen to everybody. He wants to make sure that we're doing the right things, not damaging national security, but moving out in the right direction. And I would encourage you, if you have concerns about the direction he's going, anytime you do a big shift, there's going to be a resistance, and it will disrupt. But at the end of the day, I think he's very serious about it. As far as the timeline, you'd have to talk to him. But you know, I think his vision is a little bit bigger than the Air Force's vision at this point. I wouldn't say a little bit; it's significantly.
Congressman, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so
this
much.
morning.
Yep.
Fantastic.